Mr Gapes, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And it's also a pleasure to follow the honourable member, who is a fellow member of the Council of Europe with me, so I can understand some of what he is saying, and actually agree with a lot of what he's saying. The convention, of course, has been around since the early 1950s, and it's just worth remembering that it was 1965 when we agreed to abide by its decisions in the UK. So we've had almost 60 years of relationship with the Court of Human Rights and with the decisions of the human rights. But the point that I would start off by making is that the Convention is not the same as the HRA, and the EU is not the same as the Council of Europe. The two are very different, and we should take them as being different. Now, I have a lot of time for the Convention, and I agree with much of what he said about the Convention. And I was particularly irritated during the referendum campaign that a lot of people got the ECHR confused with the European Court of Justice. The two are completely separate. One is owned by the European Union, and the other is owned by the Council of Europe, as it were. Now, I would actually go on to say that the single biggest contribution to peace in Europe since the end of the Second World War has come from the Convention on Human Rights, together with work that NATO has been doing. And I think that we should state that, and we should be proud of it, because it was something that we were very much involved with from the beginning. And as the honourable gentleman and I know only too well, the European Court of Human Rights comes with a democratic mandate. He and I spend a lot of time, I imagine he spends a lot of time, as I do, voting for the judges that are put up in order to sit on the European Court of Human Rights. And that gives a democratic control, but also is a means of reflecting, to a certain extent, a mixture of politics and competence and a whole number of things that give the European Court of Human Rights its particular character. I am not as enamoured at all of the EU involvement with human rights. I think that has created a very mixed picture. And I think if it's not using the term wrongly, I think that the European Union has tried to steal the mandate of the Council of Europe in this, which, as he and I know, applies to almost twice the number of countries that the EU does. And I think that has a large part of its strength there. And, of course, the relationship between the EU and the European Court of Human Rights is something that we are still debating at the Council of Europe. The UK involvement with the European Court of Human Rights has been a huge success story, as he rightly points out. And it has been a very good illustration of how, actually, human rights overall are doing quite well in this country. I don't agree with him on the need to extend those human rights to things like housing. I think, to be honest, that is a route of socialist involvement in the running of this country that I do not agree with, and I would steer clear of. But I will briefly, of course.
Does the honourable gentleman recognise that there are countries across the world, such as South Africa, the new South African constitution, and also some of the Nordic countries that have a right to adequate housing in their constitutions? Would he consider these to be socialist countries?
Well, when the EU decided to bring out its own human rights framework, it thought very carefully about what should be in there. And actually, with only a number of a few exceptions, did it differ from what the European Court of Human Rights did. I will give way.
When the ECHR was opened for signature in November of 1950 in Rome, the government, of course, in this country from 1945 to 51 was a Labour government. So will he praise the socialist government under which the ECHR was originally conceived?
I and plays politics with human rights, which I think is unworthy of him and unworthy of this chamber. But if I can return to the issue that I was talking about, which was the success of the British government with the European Court of Human Rights, something like 90% of applications that are brought before the European Court of Human Rights are deemed unacceptable and are not taken forward. And of those that are taken forward, since 1975, a quarter of those in a quarter of those, the European Court of Human Rights has found no violation at all. So our track record there is particularly successful. Now, there are two cases that I would like to bring up because they illustrate the extremes of the Council. The first is the Gurkhas, who a few years ago, members may remember that we moved their headquarters back to the UK, and we moved their pensions onto the same basis as UK soldiers. And they took their case to the European Court of Human Rights, who looked at their case and decided that there had been no real discrimination undertaken against them. And they found for the British government in that. But in a similar, well, slightly different case, the UK's mass surveillance regime that it uses as part of its security operations, the European Court found that the UK had violated the Human Rights Convention and had asked for some changes. Now that brings us on to a very tricky issue, and that is the role of human rights against legislation to look at terrorism and how to deal with that. And I agree with the Honourable Gentleman that when we look at this, it should be looked at in the context of what makes us a much better world to live in. And I'm not one of those who believes that tearing up the Human Rights Convention is the best way to protect us against terrorism. But having said that, he will know that at the last Council of Europe meeting, when the issue came up of whether we deprived those who had gone to fight with ISIS of their passports, I enthusiastically supported that motion and that we should not have them back. So the role of human rights in this plays out at different levels and in different ways. Now, if one looks at the way in which the Human Rights Court works, the first thing that you have to make sure that people understand is that you have to have exhausted all the domestic remedies first. You cannot go straight to the European Court of Human Rights. You have to have exhausted all domestic remedies first. And there has to be an alleged violation against the Convention. And there has to be a significant disadvantage that comes out of that. So in the response that I would like to hear from ministers, it really does go back to what they have already said. And indeed, I think it was this minister who specifically said the UK will remain a party to the ECHR after it has left the European Union. The decision to leave the European Union does not change our strong commitment to recognising and respecting human rights. I'm not sure whether the Minister remembers making that statement, but it was in the main chamber on a question from the member from Carshalton. And I agree with him wholeheartedly on that. Human rights are too important to be used as a political football in this game of Brexit or indeed in anything else. And that we have a long and very successful track record of using our involvement with the European Court of Human Rights, of using our long relationship with the Council of Europe that looks after it, and of protecting the interests of British citizens.